There's that. We're recording. Okay.
Where will this be? Is this just for YouTube or for your own? What are you recording it for? Or is that just everything has to be recorded?
We post most of our stuff later, but we'll talk about that.
Sure.
We just record everything.
Cool.
That's the ghost. That's a ghost voice you guys are hearing, folks. That's like the voice of God, who will be introduced in momentarily. Hey everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. We're so thrilled to have you here for our continuing author event series, which we have been doing in kind of this virtual space for going on a couple of years here. And it's been a really great way to stay connected with all of you and also still get to connect with authors and writers that haven't been able to make it here to Tulsa. And it's a great tether, and also wonderful to have everyone here with us tonight. We have a lot of great stuff still coming up. I won't go through the whole calendar of events, but I would encourage you to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and you can see all the things we have lined up, and hopefully kind of a hybrid mix moving forward of some in-person events and some virtual events still down the road. Really thrilled for tonight's event. I've been doing book events for almost 20 years here in Tulsa in one shape or another. And probably since 2003, 2004, I've been always wanting to get Chuck Klosterman to Tulsa. That was when I was in my early to mid 20s, I was trying to figure out ways to do that and make that happen. And then one day in 2007, which was the centennial of Oklahoma, I was reading Esquire magazine, and there was an article in there by Chuck Klosterman, and it was about him coming to Tulsa to observe this strange unburying of a time capsule that we had here. But the time capsule wasn't a time capsule; it was a car. I believe it was a Belvedere, some vintage car, and the first thing I thought was, how the hell did Chuck Klosterman get into Tulsa without me knowing about it? And how did we miss this amazing opportunity? I felt like we lost our chance. Like, we're never going to get him here again. He kind of slipped in and slipped out and wrote this great piece. But then luckily, several years ago, we were able to finally bring Chuck to Tulsa. And we did this really great event at the historic Cain's Ballroom, had a ton of people there and just had a blast. So having this be kind of, I would say, kind of maybe a 2.5 times Chuck's been to Tulsa, if we can count a virtual trip. So we'll call this his 2.5 visit to Tulsa for this wonderful book, The 90s. I grew up in the 90s. I was turned 10 in 1990. I graduated high school in the spring of 1999. I turned 19 on July 19th of 1999. So like the 90s, I'm just in it, So reading this book, we were talking earlier, my first job in high school was working at a video store. So I kind of had a super 90s-esque existence from my adolescent years. And so being able to look at this book as a work of history, I love, David Halberstram's work and people who've been able to look back to certain time periods and get an understanding of what was happening then, and the way that Chuck looks at this through pop culture, but also through a different kind of lens. Some of us, I think, if we grew up in the 90s, you look back to the 90s, and 1990 feels as distant as maybe the year 2000. As the time has changed, and he really deals with how we think about time, how we think about decades. When do decades start? When do they end? What makes a decade a decade? And of course, do decades exist at all anymore? So if you haven't had a chance to dive into the book yet, you're in for quite a treat. Couldn't be more thrilled to have him with us tonight to talk to you guys, take some questions, get those questions ready, and have a fun time. So I want to give a big welcome to our very special guest for this evening and turn it over to Mr. Chuck Klosterman. Hello, Chuck.
Hello.
All right, I'll let you take it from here. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay. Thanks for everyone who is here. This is normally the part of a book event where I would be, it's great to be here. And then I would sort of make little jokes about Tulsa. I'd probably talk about like the Golden Hurricane football program. I might talk about that thing he was saying where I came here to look at a time capsule. I believe Steve Largent may have been from Tulsa or something. I just kind of make things like that, make these references. But, I can't really honestly say it's great to be here because I'm not there. I'm still in Portland, when this book was sort of, being put together, we had this idea that it'd probably come out in a normal world like last fall. But we thought, aha, there's this pandemic going on. It's like, the world maybe won't be back to normal yet. So we'll wait until February. And then the book will come out in February and everything. I'll be touring. I'll go down the East Coast and the West Coast and the middle of the country and all of this. But obviously that didn't happen. We're still doing things like this. Now, there should be so many upsides to doing book events in this way when I think about it. Like if I was like had a whiteboard behind me and I was listing the good things and the bad things, there are really a bunch of good things, right? I don't have to travel. After I get done with this, I will walk out of my office here, which is kind of a little cabin in the woods, walk up to my house. My kids will be there. Don't got to stay in a hotel. Don't got to fly. Don't have to do anything like that. So that's nice. The audience could theoretically be huge. I did one of these for the bookstore in Portland. There was like 700 people who came on to the Zoom call. That could never happen at that store. You couldn't have 700 people watching you at one time. It's a lot for a bookstore. The audience could also be from anywhere. I'm guessing most people listening to this are from Oklahoma, but it could be somebody from Nova Scotia. It could be somebody from, Bangor, Maine. And then moreover, it actually sort of simulates the experience of writing a book, because where I'm sitting at right now, the computer I'm using is where I wrote this book. Like, this is it. This is like the closest you could possibly be to experiencing what it would be like to watch me write a book. Like if my fingers were typing like this, that's how it would be. So there are all these theoretical upsides, but you know what? I kind of fucking hate doing it like this. I don't like it because, and this is the main reason, I feel like a totally insane person just talking to a picture of myself. Like it's so strange to do this. Like if we were doing this in person, however many people there are, because like 75 or whatever, it's like you'd be sitting there and maybe you'd be kind of like tittering and laughing a little bit. And it would seem like, oh, hey, we're having this live event. Now I just feel like a crazy person. It almost seems like I'm in a movie, but it's a bad movie with a low budget and they have a bunch of exposition they need to get in. So they create a scenario in the narrative where a character talks to himself into a computer. A little bit like how McLaughlin used to talk in the recorder on Twin Peaks, but not that creative because I'm just emoting right into the screen. Makes me feel real weird. But that's how we got to do it. So that's how we're going to do it. Okay. Now, as you may have noticed, just from the last 2 years of using Zoom, I suppose, there's like a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'm really hoping that you ask questions because I love answering questions. I think it's the main reason people go to book events is to sort of see what the person is like, see how they sound, maybe learn about the book, maybe watch a reading, but for the most part, be able to sort of talk to this person in a way that transcends a book. Because when you're reading a book, it's kind of one-way experience, right? It's like the words are there, you're taking them into your brain. Maybe you're constructing an image in your head of what you're seeing. But for the most part, like it's not a very human experience. Well, it's a human experience for one human. It's not like a social experience. It's a little more social. So feel free to ask questions. You don't gotta, and I know you might feel an obligation to say, ask questions about the book itself, or about the 90s. Maybe you'll think like I should ask a question about the process of writing or something. You can do any of that, but also you can ask anything else. I do not care what the question is. In fact, if you ask a weird question, the likelihood of me answering it is probably going to go up. So ask as many questions as you want. But first, okay. So since this is technically a book event where I'm promoting this book, this one right here, which I think for this thing, the thing you're at now, you actually had to buy the book like as a ticket to get in which case I'm extremely flattered you did that. I mean, that's amazing to me that you'd be like, I'm going to invest $25 partially so I can just see someone on a monitor. That's incredible. Not to mention the fact that I'm really pleased you won the book. So when I say thank you, it's like, I'm not just saying that, like it blows my mind. I've been doing this for 20 years. I still can't believe it. Still can't believe a bunch of people right now are looking at their computer to watch me. I can't it seems insane. Why would I don't know. It's amazing to me. So thank you. Okay. But if you're curious, like, why the 90s? Why did I do a book on the 90s? Well, a whole bunch of reasons. I think the principal one was that I suspect in the coming 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a lot of writing about this period of time. I think it's already starting, maybe even started before this book came out. Well, in fact, I know it did. And I suspect that what's going to happen is a lot of people are going to do somewhat revisionist versions of the 90s, which is kind of just the popular way contemporary history is done now, that people sort of look back at a time and anything that seemed obviously important, they now say, well, that wasn't important. It was this minor thing that really matters. Or they'll look back at a band like Nirvana or whatever and be like, oh, sure, Nirvana got all the headlines, but, it was actually, Bikini Kill that was more important. It was always like, what I'm saying is it seems as though the typical way that people write about the recent past is to say whatever seemed to be real was false, and whatever we didn't recognize was essential. And while I have no problem with this philosophy, and I think it's very good and kind of healthy for the discourse, I did want there to be a version that I felt was kind of like straight down the middle, like the pitcher who only throws fastballs and changeups. Like, this is like, these are the things that collectively seemed to create a backbone, not for every person, of course, but sort of a cultural, sort of, like some connecting fluid, a shared experience. I mean, the 90s were still part of the monoculture, and we don't really have that anymore. We only talk about the monoculture now as a way to illustrate how it no longer exists. But at one point, that was like a very real thing. Now, here again, I'm not saying that everybody had the same experience. I'm not saying I speak for all people or anything like that, but I did want to create a kind of a foundational baseline history of the 90s that these other people could disagree with later. I also think the 90s are important because it was the last decade of the 20th century, but I think in many ways, it's kind of the last decade that there's going to be in terms of the way we used to understand the framing of time. Like, I framed the 90s in this book, starting with the release of Nirvana's Nevermind and ending with 9/11. Now, it's kind of become popular to frame the 90s by saying, well, they really started when the Berlin Wall fell in fall of '89 and then ended on September 11th of 2001. But I didn't use that framing device because I think there's a problem with it. And the problem being the year 1990, which was obviously after the fall of that wall, was kind of the 1980s on autopilot. Like, 1990 in many textural ways is still very much like the 80s. I mean, I'd mentioned Twin Peaks. Yes, Twin Peaks was on, but Cheers was still the most popular show in 1990. People were still ordering things in catalogs at Christmas. Nobody was shopping online. Michael Jordan had ascended, but Larry Bird and Magic Johnson were still sort of the faces of the NBA. All these things that we associate with the 80s were still happening in 1990. New Kids on the Block had a huge tour that year. And it wasn't until the fall of 91 that the 90s cliches and caricatures and the characteristics we associate with it, wrongly or rightly, that sort of begins with the advent of, I guess, grunge becoming mainstream music, but more so the rippling effect Nirvana had in non-musical ways. And I can talk about that if somebody wants me to ask me about it or whatever. It's like, it was the last time rock music sort of had this central impact on society that moved outside of itself. And then a lot of the things, in the 90s in many ways are kind of bifurcated too, that there's this certain culture that we had in the early part of the 90s, and then the second culture that came later. But that's as interesting to me because I don't think going forward, it's going to feel that way. I know many people will say, oh, you're just making this decision based on your age, that everything stopped in the 90s. I'm not saying that. I'm saying something has changed, though, about the way we experience time. And it's not just me saying this. I'm not this isn't my theory, really. It's a theory by a guy named Mark Fisher, who's dead now, but he was a kind of a British theorist, kind of an anti-capitalist theorist. And he has this idea, or had this idea, called the slow cancellation of the future, which has to do with the fact that because we now have access to all content simultaneously in a way that we never did before, it has sort of changed the experience of moving through time. From like World War II up till 9/11, basically, time moved in a very linear way. At least I'm talking cultural time. That, an artist or a film or a book would come out and it would sort of maybe capture the zeitgeist of the time, the thinking of the time, and then time would move forward. And if you wanted to get back to that thing, you actually had to kind of, within this analogy, turn around and move back, because the scenery around you was changing as you moved down this road. Okay. But now because of the internet and because of a lot of things, but mainly the internet, we have access to all culture at all times. It is just as easy to learn about an event from 1972 as it was to learn about an event that happened in the news yesterday. Everything now is, instead of a road, like a large, shallow ocean, a vast ocean that isn't very deep, that anyone can wade out to with a bucket and just scoop up whatever element of time you need. And that has changed our feeling of what change means, or how change is experienced. And I see the 90s as like a way to sort of explain the end of that previous thinking. So that seemed important to me. And frankly, I suppose part of it has to do, my desire is partially built around the fact that I was, started college in 1990, and, I was in my late 20s at the end of it. So my young adulthood does coincide with this. So maybe do I inflate its importance because it happened to me? Well, possibly. Although at the same time in this book, I kind of argue how the Generation X demographic is like the least significant canonical generation, and probably has the least, lasting impact. There probably will never be a Generation X president, for example. So I'm not really lionizing the 90s. I'm not saying the 90s were somehow superior to any other stretch of time or any other era. That's just not how it was, And I think that people, if you're out there, like I'm going to turn 50 this summer, if you're roughly around my age and you remember what it was like to be a 90s person, you would never argue that the 90s were more significant than another time. You would never argue that your generation was particularly meaningful. It kind of contradicted the ethos of what a person in the 90s was like. So my interest in the 90s, while probably is personal, is not really part of this book. This is the 12th book I've written now. And if you've read the other 11 or any of the other 11, you might think they're good, or you might think they're bad, or you might think that they're overrated or underrated or whatever. But I would guess you would probably agree that it might seem like I was the only person who could have written those books, because a lot of the perspective in there was specifically mine. This book's not like that, okay? This book has more distance, at least from the writer, the writer being me. Like there's not stories of my life in this book. Is it perfectly objective? I'm sure it isn't, because a perfect objectivity is impossible. But, I tried. I really did. I tried to sort of look at the world, not through my eyes, but through the eyes of many different people. And I tried to focus on the things that those many different sets of eyes might have viewed in a somewhat similar way. Now, whether or not I succeed at that, I can't. I mean, I did the best I could. It'll be up to you, I guess, to decide if, when you read this book, if you do, if you feel that my portrait of this time seems fair, seems accurate. That was my intention. So that's why this book exists. So we're 20 minutes past. I see there's 17 Q&As, 17 questions, no A's yet, only Q's. And typically when I do this, when I start taking questions, I get a lot more. So I'm going to start taking these questions, and I'll just see what people want to talk about. And if we run out, then maybe I'll go back and read the book, but hopefully that will not happen, because I have to say the idea of watching someone on Zoom read from a book does to me sort of represent a low point in like cultural history. Like that seems to be something that the world doesn't need to watch a man read on a computer. So let me just open this up here. Okay. The first question is from someone named Jennifer Smith Lawson. It's a good name. Okay. One of my favorite of Klosterman's essays is about Britney Spears and whether she's smart and calculated or really that naive. What does he think now in the wake of Free Britney? Oh, and it says that I inspired her to become a journalist. Well, that's nice. First of all, it's a big compliment. Okay, when the Britney Spears, the Free Britney thing happened, like the whole end of the conservatory, all that stuff, I think it was HBO. It was HBO or maybe it was Netflix. There was the documentary about her. You know what I'm talking about. Occasionally people did ask me about this story I wrote about Britney Spears in 2003. Okay. Esquire wanted me to do a cover story on Britney Spears because they wanted to put Britney Spears on the cover of the magazine wearing only a sweater, which replicated a photograph of Angie Dickinson from the past, like a kind of a famous Esquire photo of Angie Dickinson. So they put Britney in this issue called like Women We Love. That was the name of the issue. Now, what was complicated about this is Britney was very young and, she was making this transition from being like a teen pop artist who was completely insulated from the media. That, it was like it was hard to interview her without her publicist being there, or people would ask her questions about what kind of shampoo and conditioner she used, stuff like that, and now she's transitioning away from that. Now she was becoming an adult artist. So in some ways, maybe the interview I did with her was one of the first real interviews she ever did. And, I suppose in retrospect now, if someone went back and read that, they would think I was unfair to her and that there was some kind of weird thing. I mean, what's also funny is when people complain about that piece now, they're like, well, Britney Spears, she was 18 at the time. Why is this 50-year-old guy writing about her? It's like, well, I wasn't 50 then. I was like 30. It was like, it didn't seem weird for me to be doing it at the time. It's very often when this happens now, it's like they look at the person who's like the victim of the situation, the person perceived as the victim, and their age is whatever they were at the time. And then the person who committed the offense, they kind of assume that I was always this age. It's odd. But what do I think of this now? It was strange to do that piece because the issue is called Women We Love. So like I was having to do this positive, in a way, a positive story on Britney Spears. So I was like, well, does she not have much to say, or is she a genius? That's kind of the question that I pose in this. And in truth, I think one of those two answers is kind of obvious. But at the same time, if I could go back and do it again, I would do it differently, because almost everything in my life, if I could do again, I would do slightly differently. Okay. Andy Towers says, hi from Alabama. Great. At this part of your career, is there any part of your writing that comes easier? Is there anything that is more difficult? Well, okay. I would say the two most important aspects to writing are voice and structure. In other words, the voice of the person writing, does it kind of transmit through the page? And structure. Does the way the story is put together kind of make logical, comfortable sense for the person consuming the book? And those things kind of, I feel like I was always able to do that. I mean, like whenever people ask, like if you take a creative writing class, they're like, how do you find your voice? How do you find your voice? Your voice is just in you. All you got to do is get it out. You know what finding. There's no finding it. It's not hiding. It's in you. So it's just pulling it out of you. It was probably was there before you even knew what a voice was. And structure, I guess I just am fortunate that I guess for whatever reason, that just is really easy for me. Things that are harder is I'm much more critical of myself now, so it makes writing much less enjoyable. I used to really enjoy the experience of writing. And now as I've gotten older, it has become a little more like work. I mean, I still like it, but it's not the same, because I guess in a sense, when I was younger, I had this desire to be understood, like, oh, I want people to to know what I think of these things. And that has happened more than enough. I don't feel unheard at all. Like, I make this joke sometimes, like you'll see on social media, somebody will post something and they'll type under like, I feel seen, basically saying like, this meme makes me feel as though people understand me. I've never felt unseen. It's been years, 20, it's like, I feel like I'm overseen in a way. Things that come easier, I suppose would be like, I feel like it's less likely that I'm going to make a huge mistake based out of ignorance. That will still happen sometimes, where I'll write something and then later I'll just realize I didn't know enough about that. Like, I shouldn't have been writing about that. I didn't fully understand it. But that happens less now, partially because I've gotten a little smarter, and also partially because I'm more nervous about that. Whereas when I was younger, a lot of my writing was just kind of unconscious, like just go in and do it. I mean, if I was a musician, I would be the kind of musician who's like, I never took a lesson. I just picked up this harp and started playing the harp and played it the way I wanted it. And some people think it's okay, and some people think it's terrible, but it's the way I like it. So as a consequence, if you kind of learn in an autodidactic way, you can make strange, kind of curious mistakes as you go. Okay, why do you think people, asks Christinosaurus, why do you think people that grew up in the 90s seem to be so much more nostalgic for the 90s than a lot of other decades? Well, I mean, okay, so the question, what is nostalgia? Okay. Like this book, people say, oh, it's a nostalgic look at the 90s. No, it's not. Because what nostalgia is looking back on periods of time that you experienced, or usually that you experienced, and then injecting your emotional memory into that memory. So this is why, like my dad was born in 1928. He's dead now, but sometimes he would talk about the Great Depression in kind of a positive way. Like it was a good, even though it was obviously awful, like they were barely living but he would take the emotional memory of being a young person and put it into that memory and change it. In this book, I don't really do that. Or at least it doesn't feel like it. Like it doesn't feel like this is my attempt to sort of remember how great the 90s were. Now you say, why do you think people who grew up in the 90s seem to be more nostalgic for the 90s than other decades? Well, it's because they have a real connection to it that is emotional. Like they can remember things from like, I don't know, Britpop or whatever, going to like some Quentin Tarantino movie or whatever. And it's like, they are remembering their own life. They're remembering when they did these things. And that kind of alters and colors and kind of shapes or misshapes the memory itself. There is a phenomenon where people are nostalgic for things they never experienced. And that's a very interesting deal. There was a movie, Kicking and Screaming, from the 90s, Noah Baumbach movie. And one of the characters in it is talking about how he kind of wishes he was like a doughboy coming back from World War II. He's nostalgic for this thing he never knew. But that's a different thing. That's like an intellectual kind of nostalgia. Most nostalgia is emotional. And to have the emotional experience, you need to have some context for yourself being in the scenario you're remembering. Chuck, do you still drink Mountain Dew every day? Most days. I have one, or I have Dr. Pepper sometimes. Okay, I drink a lot of coffee now. This is one change. Until I had kids, I didn't drink coffee. I liked the way it smelled, but I didn't like the way it tasted. And there was a period when my kids were little, I needed to drink coffee. And now I'm addicted to coffee in a way I've never been addicted to anything. And I've put a lot of crazy things in my body that should be more addictive than coffee, but nothing is like coffee. So now every morning I drink coffee immediately, and then sometimes I have a second cup of coffee, and then sometimes I have a third cup of coffee. But then at noon, when I have lunch, I may have a Mountain Dew, but I get small cans of it. Like they're not full 12-ounce cans, they're 8-ounce cans. So in some ways, I'm consuming less. Although it's a little bit like I was talking about this in some podcast I was doing promoting this book. In 1994, I interviewed Slash from Guns N' Roses. He was putting out a solo record, Slash's Snake Pit. So I'm talking to him on the phone, and he's like, I quit drinking. And I'm like, you quit drinking? That's amazing. And he's like, oh yeah, now all I do every day is I take a 32-ounce cup and I fill it up with vodka and cranberry, and I just sip it all afternoon. And I was like, well, that's an interesting way to describe quitting drinking, but in a way I know what he means. Carrie Wien said, I liked the part in the Control-Alt-Delete chapter, this is the chapter in the book about the internet, that reminded me that I did not accept that using a telephone costs money. And I remember being faced with putting coins in a phone or calling the operator to make a collect call. I'm not sure if there's a question in there, but it was a nice recollection that I hadn't considered in a very long time. Well, this is something that is, sometimes the world changes, and it's not that we say, oh, it used to be this way, now it's this way. We just kind of pretend the way it was never happened, and it was always the way it is now. The idea that long distance calling cost money, or local calls on a payphone cost a quarter or whatever, it's not even part of our thinking anymore. But like when I was in college, if a couple was dating in high school and they went to different colleges, they'd just break up because they couldn't call each other every day. They'd be like, we can't afford it. I can't pay $4 every day to talk to you. Let's just break up. Like that would never happen now. Like if people went to different colleges, they might break up, but it wouldn't be because they couldn't stay in contact or afford to stay in contact. I mean, my nieces and nephews, I have there's 7 people in my family and I'm the youngest kid. So I have some nieces and nephews who are in their 30s now, but like when they were in college, they would text their parents every day. Like every single day, they never even lost touch with their parents. So, that is a change in communication, which, I mean, I guess I got to say is totally positive, because there are friends of mine from New York who I still have a real relationship with, even though we don't live in the same place anymore, because we text pretty much every day. And in some ways, our relationship might even be richer, because instead of talking about what we're experiencing, we're talking about like what's in our mind. So that's interesting. What did you think of the Super Bowl halftime show? I loved it and thought it was fitting for the 90s. I did think it was very good. I thought it was a good halftime show. And, it was still a halftime show, though. So, like, you're not really watching it for the quality of the performances. It's more like you're happy they picked the people that they picked. That's really what it is. Like, this was an all hip hop show. It was sort of the people in the orbit of Dr. Dre. That's kind of like what 50 Cent was surprisingly there and all that. It did have a real 90s feel to it for sure. But like a person in the 90s is now a middle-aged person. And the Super Bowl halftime show is really what the halftime show is there for, very consciously, is for people who aren't interested in football, but are still involved with the Super Bowl. They're at a Super Bowl party. People are over at their house and they're going to have to watch this. So there's always this talk. It's like, why don't they have Metallica play, the Super Bowl halftime show? I'm sure the fan base for the football game would rather see Metallica, than Mary J. Blige or whatever. And, that's true. But the people who love football are already watching the game. You don't got to convince them. So they're there. Yeah. Do you have any fun stories, asked Jeffrey, about working with Bill Simmons? Well, it depends what you mean by fun. I mean, we did Grantland together, and it was fun and stressful. And sometimes Bill and I disagreed on stuff, but it was, kind of an amazing period where we could just get any of the writers we liked and let them do whatever they want. I mean, Grantland was the only place I ever worked where if you pitched an idea, the likelihood of it being okayed increased if the idea was fucking crazy. Like if you came in and you were like, hey, I want to do a story on the future of LeBron or whatever, they'd be like, oh yeah, we could do that. Sure. But if someone said like, hey, I want to do a story on Tiger Woods, but I want to compare him to an actual tiger. Like, what does Tiger Woods eat and what does a tiger eat? And so then people be like, great, go do it. Do that story. That's wonderful. Philip Clements says, how do you find a balance? What's this going to be? Between the art writing you consume and your own writing. In other words, how do you use the thoughts of others to bolster and evolve your own thoughts without ripping them off in an overtly blatant way? Well, I guess in a sense, because when I read other arts criticism, even the best arts criticism, Wesley Morris, Rob Sheffield, Alex Papadimos, whoever, I still often disagree with it. Like, there's reading a story by somebody that's like Joan Didion. Even I'm reading Joan Didion, and half the time I'm like, I think she's wrong about this. So it would be hard for me to really rip them off, because I'd be ripping off an idea I don't fully support. So I need to change it just to make it match my own mind. I first discovered you in 2003 when I saw a character reading Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs on the OC. Forever thankful for that. How did you feel when your book was shown on such a popular TV show at the time? Okay, what she's talking about is there's an episode, I think there's actually 2 episodes of the OC, where this character, I believe his name was Seth, and I'm saying this because I honestly did not watch the show even one time, except these 2 events when my book was involved. This character, Seth, was like reading my book in a swimming pool. You can really see it very clearly. And then I think later there's an episode where like somebody's mom goes to rehab and they give him a copy of Killing Yourself to Live. It's because of the guy who created the show, I guess, like these books, and I kind of became, I wouldn't say friends, but like a little acquainted with him. How did I feel when this happened? Well, I'll tell you what. I was in a diner in New York on a date, it wasn't really a date. I was my girlfriend, so I guess we were just kind of eating. I guess it's a date. And all of a sudden, I got like 19 texts from 19 different people, which means I know exactly how many people I know watch the OC. That was very, it was odd. What was also funny is that for like a year or 2, I guess maybe 10 years still, occasionally in a book reading, like a guy who you could tell like really liked like maybe Hunter S. Thompson or something, he'd like ask a question like, how do you feel that you were in the OC? Like, did you feel compromised? But got used in this way. So it's like, hey man, I don't care about what the show is like. I mean, be on a show, it's flattering. It's a little bit cool, but it's mostly just amazing. Like I can't believe that this happens ever. There was an episode of that show, You're the Worst, where a character mentions me too. I'm not bragging about this. I didn't do anything about it. It's not any credit to me, but it is amazing for me to think of something that I always associated as outside my own reality, encompassing myself in that story. So I don't know. I'm happy it happened. As you write a recent history, asked Lori Walker, like you did in the 90s, how do you take into account the likelihood of changing interpretations and perspectives of the event? Well, okay, there is going to be different interpretations and perspectives on the event, but the events are not going to change. Like Clinton is going to be the president for the 90s. It's like, it doesn't, like no one's interpretation or perspective is going to change it so radically that things that happened no longer happened. I accept these other interpretations. Go ahead. I mean, that's, go forward, interpret things. That's great. Bring as many different perspectives as you want. But this is one time when I was like much less relativist. I wasn't going to look at these things and be like, well, what do I think, this meant to me? Like, what did Titanic mean to me? It's like, not this time. Like in that book, Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs I was talking about, that's like a book about the 90s where I do that. Where I talk about the 90s through the way they felt to me because of where I was and what I was doing. This is a little different. Was your first modem 300, 1200, 2400, 9600, 14400, or 28800 BPS? No idea. I'm guessing 1200. And my guess is because I know I wouldn't have had one immediately because I didn't really have the internet in my house until I moved to Akron, Ohio in 1998. So it may have even been 2400. I'm not fully sure how much, like, I don't even like BPS. I don't know what that, I mean, if I had to define it, I couldn't do it. Another question about the Super Bowl halftime show, answered that. It's getting hot in here. I'm going to turn off this. Hold on. Okay. You look at the 90s from the viewpoint of the 90s and not from the lens of today. Correct, Pat. What do you think about the way that many of the best baseball players from the 1990s have been frozen out of the Hall of Fame? He's talking about like Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens. Bonds and Clemens didn't get into the Hall at all. Maybe they'll get on by the Veterans Committee. My thinking on this is that, yes, they did something wrong. They broke the rules of baseball, but it's what was happening at the time. It's like it's kind of like when Reggie Bush, the football player, got in trouble and they rescinded his Heisman Trophy and they rescinded USC's national championship. It's like, that's crazy. Everyone knows what happened, right? We know Roger Clemens was the best pitcher of his era. We know that Barry Bonds is probably not only the best hitter of his era, quite possibly the second best hitter who ever lived. Some would say the best hitter who ever lived. So they should be in the Hall of Fame, and it's ridiculous that they're not. And I just don't get it. I don't understand what they think is going to be accomplished by this. Like, they think this will stop guys from using performance enhancing drugs. Like, they think this is like, if we punish these guys, like, performance enhancing drugs will like disappear. Well, look at the salaries baseball players are paid. Like a middle non-factor pitcher can make $18 million in a year. Do you think he's going to be like, well, okay, I can make $18 million a year doing this, but I might risk not making the Hall of Fame, which he's not going to make anyways. Of course, people are going to use any advantage they can. Okay. Guy asked me your prediction of how the Super Bowl was going to play out with Odell Beckham needing to play really well for the Rams was almost true and feels true anyway. Well, I was a little bit wrong about it, I guess. I said that it would come down to the fact that you just can't throw to Cooper Kupp every down. There's going to be a time late in the game, if it's close, where Stafford would have to go to someone else. And the guy he would go to was OBJ. And he needed to come up big in that situation. And as it turns out, not only was Odell Beckham not in the game at all because he was injured, Stafford just kept throwing to Cooper Kupp, and it worked. So I was 100% wrong on that. Doesn't feel kind of right to me. Feels 100% wrong. What readings would you suggest on the subject of time and how we process history? Well, okay, I mentioned this guy, Mark Fisher. What you really should do is go onto YouTube, put in the words Mark Fisher and the slow cancellation of the future, and watch this clip. It's about 30 or 40 minutes long. It's just him sitting at a table. But that YouTube clip heavily influenced everything about the writing of this book. Okay, Patrick Fox. Thank you, Magic City, for hosting this event. Chuck, back in the mid 2000s, you wrote an article in Esquire about assignment. Yep, about going to cover something in Tulsa. In that you described downtown Tulsa as urban sarcasm. Can you further describe that trip, and have you been back to Tulsa? If so, did you find the city to be less sarcastic? Well, what I meant, but when I said urban sarcasm, it was like, it was a very strange time to be in Tulsa, I think. Like, I don't know what was going on besides, like, maybe this was some kind of centennial event, but it was like, it had the look of a downtown area, but there were no people around. And it was almost like somebody was trying to like create a false city for a TV show or something. And the cast hadn't showed up yet. And nothing seemed like there was chain places and then but also kind of undistinct places. It was just strange. Okay. The next time I came back and went to that place, Cane's, which was a great place to do an event, Tulsa seemed totally different. Like, and I'm not just saying this, like, this is not a sycophantic thing. Like, Tulsa seemed pretty cool when I came back there because I did not expect it to be that way. It was not very cool the first time I went there, and then I came back and it was considerably better. And also, many people I talked to was like, yeah, Tulsa's better now. Like, there's some cities like that. Pittsburgh is like that. Like, Pittsburgh used to be kind of a rough place. Pittsburgh is a cool place to go now. When did it happen? Who knows? And Tulsa's sort of the same way. So I guess I did find it to be less sarcastic. It seemed a little like I don't know. It seemed a little hip, kind of. There was something going on in Tulsa that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it seemed to be happening. Okay, since you've set this book in so different than your other 11, do you see yourself going forward with the same objectivity in your next book? Okay, what this guy's asking me is, this book is different than the other 11. It's kind of a new way for me to write. Am I going to keep going in this way? Actually, probably not. And in fact, the next book that I do, I'm not going to say what it is. I'm not going to describe it, but it will be a hard kind of tack back in the other direction. It will not be objective. Justin M says, early 90s alternative music, best era of music. No, I wouldn't say that. I would say the best era of music is mainstream music from 1967 to 1972. That seems like the best that for the music I like, for rock music, that's about as good as it gets. I think that the 90s were a strong period for music. Better than music has been in a while, better than it was in the 80s. I wouldn't say it was the best era of music ever, though. This guy says, how did you end up in Akron working at the Beacon Journal? Well, kind of I don't know if the story's funny, strange story. So I'm in Fargo, right? I'm working at the Fargo newspaper. Graduate from the University of North Dakota in 94, work in Fargo for 4 years. But I want to get out of Fargo. Kind of feel like I covered every story to cover in Fargo. So I apply for a job to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which is a big newspaper in St. Louis. Now, the job was for the music writer. And as it turns out, I could have never done that job if I would have got it. I didn't know enough about hip hop yet. I didn't realize that at the time. I was like, I can do this, but I wouldn't have been ready. I would have been bad at that job, I think. But somehow I'm the runner up for this job. That comes down to me and another guy. The other guy gets it. The guy from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch calls me and tell me, hey, this job's not the job for you, but you should go to Fargo. Not this job, but you should try to sort of go someplace else. Like, it's time for your career to kind of move forward. And it's a real nice phone call. So just before he hangs up, I say, well, who did you hire? And he's like, what do you care? And I was like, I'm just curious, like, who did you hire? And he's like, some guy you've never heard of from Akron, Ohio. So then I took all my clips and my resume and just sent them to the Akron Beacon Journal the same day. So part of the reason I think they hired me is because they got this package for a job application for a guy who like hadn't even quit yet, I don't think. So I think they may have hired me because they thought I was psychic. Was there anything that stuck out to you, asks Andy Towers, from the Get Back documentary? Lots of things. I mean, to me, the most interesting thing was a scene. I think it's called like the flower pot scene because there's no video footage, but it's they mic'd up Paul McCartney and John Lennon talking about, well, George Harrison might be quitting the band, and neither one of them seemed remotely upset about it. They're like, I guess, he'll quit. We'll get somebody else. Maybe we'll get Eric Clapton in here. It's just strange. It's so common for someone like me to think about George Harrison in this way, this almost unassailable figure. He's a member of the Beatles. It's as good as it gets. But then within the Beatles, he's like a distant third. The other two guys don't even take him seriously. It shows you how the perception of things is so different from the way it is in the insular world of these scenarios, Melanie Meyer says, do you think the way people are viewing the passage of time will have an impact on the teaching of history? My kids, 13 and 10, hate history, and she's 41, love it. Is that possibly a manifestation of this change in the view of time? Or are they just kids who hate school? I don't think this is going to answer your question. I think the short answer is probably yes. I do think that's going to happen. Also, schools are much more interested in teaching kids about recent history than they used to be. Like when I was in high school, you would learn history all year. And then like the last day of school would be everything from like the Vietnam War on. Contemporary history wasn't really seen as part of the history curriculum. But you know what the weirder thing is? Okay, like my kids are 8 and 6. Okay. I don't want to I'm not going to sit here and brag about my kids. Nobody likes that. but I'll say this, like my son, he's, he's 8 years old. He's in second grade. I can tell, like, he's a good reader. He's good at math. He's pretty smart. He hates school. He hates it. And I think my wife is like, well, maybe he's bored. It's not challenging. It's like, maybe, but I think mainly he just hates it. Because you know what? When I was in second grade, I hated school. Like, I keep telling him, like, the fact of the matter is, if you're good at school, like, some people hate school because they're bad at it. And think of how terrible that would be, that they would dread going to school because they literally can't do the work. He hates school because he thinks it's boring. And I was like, someday you're going to realize that the fact that it's boring means that it was something that you kind of could naturally do. And at some point, the fact that you're good at school and good at learning things is going to make you a different kind of person, give you the ability to be who you want to be in the world, as opposed to having someone say, you got to do this. So, like, the fact that your kids, like, they hate history, I mean, they see it in a totally different way to you. Like, they might not be at a point yet when they can understand what is fascinating about the past. When I was a junior in high school, I had this world history teacher named Valentine Welder. And one day he said to us, the hardest part of this job is realizing that, to you guys, the moon landing is no different than the Civil War. And I was like, what the hell is he talking about? How does he think that I don't know the difference between a moon landing and the Civil War? But now I know exactly what he meant. He meant that for us, both those events are these distant things that predate our birth. They seem the same in some ways. They're just the story we've heard. As I got older and I started having these situations where, like, I would meet someone who was born after, say, the Iran hostage situation. Okay. When I can still remember that. I was a little kid. I was like in second grade, but I could remember when that was going on. And to them, it was like, it's amazing this happened. Well, what was the situation? I was like, well, it's really weird that things I remember are things that to you are just stories. And that might be a situation with your kids. Okay. Hi, Chuck, says Adria Tyndall. Tyndall? No. My parents and I are tuned in and big fans of your writing. We're originally from Minnesota. I was born in Minnesota. I'm watching from suburban Chicago, and my parents are in Tennessee, so this is great for us. I would love to hear your thoughts on how Gen X connected to and reacted to the recent Super Bowl halftime show. People are into this halftime show. I think there is this sense that people often have. It's like, oh, good, finally, music that was my music. I'm finally seeing music that was my music. In the past, it was just music for old people. And then they're like, 10 seconds later, they're like, wait a second. If the show is always music for old people, and this is my music, that must mean... do you think you will revisit Downtown Owl or write another timepiece novel? I don't think I'll revisit it. They say they're making a movie about it. I keep hearing they're going to make this movie about Downtown Owl. I mean, I act like I don't know nothing. I get emails from the people doing it. Like, Michael Shannon's supposed to be in it. Aubrey Plaza's supposed to be in it. They say this. I'm very skeptical, because every time someone's tried to make a movie or a TV show or one of my books, it falls apart at the end. But I don't think as a writer would I revisit it. No, I don't think that. I don't like a sequel to Downtown Owl. I don't think that will ever happen. Was there like would I write another timepiece novel like it though? I think that's very possible. I could see myself doing that. What time? I don't know. Maybe sometimes I thought it'd be fun to do a story about. I won't go into it. Okay. Thank you for being here, Chuck, says Sarah. Killing Yourself to Live is one of my favorite books. Well, it's my favorite book that I've written too there, Sarah. I would never go back and read it. I kind of can't believe I did it because I talked way too candidly about my own life and way too casually about other people. It blows my mind that I just didn't think it would be a big deal to write about these women I'd been in love with and talk about our lives. Kind of thought it'd be interesting to them. Of course, it wasn't interesting to them necessarily. Maybe it was, but also weird. So I can't believe I did it. I would never do it again, but I'm glad I did it once, because someday I'm going to go back and read that book, and it's going to be like going back in time. Okay, this guy, no, I shouldn't say Lane Farman, could be a girl, I guess, but I think it's a guy, kind of like Lane Staley. I would love to hear you speak on Slacker. I think it's because I got a Slacker poster behind me. And I've talked about Slacker a lot in my life. It's not in this book because I feel like I've talked about it too much, maybe. Also, my wife did the oral history of Dazed and Confused, and I don't want to see like I'm Richard Linklater's publicist. But I will say this about Slacker. I've told this story a bunch, and if you've heard, you can just space out for 20 seconds. But like, so in 1992, I'm going to summer school at UND, and I got a work study job in the geography department. And my work study job was for 2 hours a day. I had to count maps. There was a room just filled with maps in the geography department. And they wanted to know how many maps were there, thousands and thousands of maps. So my job was to go and count like how many maps were in each drawer. It's a very dull job, but I could listen to the radio. So I come home from that job one day, and my roommate, a guy named Rex, is watching a movie on VHS that he has rented from the video store. And he's like 20 minutes in, and he's like, I think you want to watch this with me. And I'm like, what is it? And he's like, I'm just going to rewind it. So he rewinds it, and we watch Slacker together. And I am super skeptical of people who say, you know, this band changed my life, or this movie changed my life. But I got to say, this movie changed my life. It changed the way I thought about narrative and what a story can be, and what people are actually like, and what makes a person interesting, and how an unconventional thing in many ways has a value that a conventional thing can never possess. So we watched Slacker, rewound it, and watched it again. We watched it twice, back to back, like I guess in the afternoon and then early evening. And, you know, is it my, like, okay, is it my favorite movie of all time? Absolutely. Is it the best movie of all time? Oh, no. I don't even think, I'm sure, in fact, if you asked Richard Linklater, he might say it's among his weakest movies in some ways, I bet, because technically it's kind of amateur and all these things. There's no actors, or just people. But the philosophies in this thing, and I don't mean the philosophies expressed, I mean the philosophies that are sort of baked into the interactions of these people. I'll never have an experience like that, because this is a movie without a plot. If you've never heard of it, there's no plot to Slacker. And then as you start watching it, you think there's going to be a plot. You keep thinking these characters are going to connect. They don't. But I don't know. It was a big deal for me. It's kind of cool, you know, when you're 20, 19, 18, those ages, things like a movie really can have these impacts that you just could never understand otherwise. Okay. Nearly 15 years ago, Tim Landis asked this question. He knows what's going on. Nearly 15 years ago to the day, Esquire published your essay, You Say You Want a Revolution, with the subhead, well, you know it ain't going to happen, not here. In the piece you state, nothing could make this happen, and B, no one would know what to do if it somehow did. What are your thoughts in the wake of what happened last January and the rise of social media? Well, okay, this might be a surprising answer, but like, the thing that happened on January 6th is proof that a revolution is not going to work here. It's not going to happen. If there would be a revolution, a real revolt from either side, the right or the left, the lives of almost everyone in the United States would get worse. Even the people who think their life would improve now. So I don't know, maybe I'm trying to be optimistic, but I still kind of believe this. I still believe that, like, in some ways, the United States is immune to being completely reinvented by a mob, any kind of mob. I won't accept it. Okay, we're going to take a few more questions here. What are your thoughts overall on journalism today, and how has it changed since you began? Well, it's definitely worse. There's no question about it. You know, a lot of the things to me that defined what journalism was supposed to be have just been completely removed. You know, the idea that instead of trying to reflect reality, it has now seemed to be a way to influence reality. And there's an activist element to it, which to me is contradictory to the idea of why someone goes into journalism. It's troubling to me, yet I also understand that it's a natural evolution, and I just got to accept it. What is your favorite band from the early 90s? The Cardigans or Oasis? Maybe one more. Let's see. Okay. Do women still love John Cusack more than you? This will be the last question. I mean, in a broad sense, I'm sure they do. Why wouldn't they? I think my wife loves me more than John Cusack. You know, I'm pretty certain about that. But you know, John Cusack has changed too. Like John Cusack has now become sort of a polarizing figure. I mean, he's just like, you know, so kind of aggressively political that I think even the people who agree with his politics are sometimes like, he's kind of out there now. He's like looking for fights or whatever. So he doesn't seem as, I don't know, as kind of charming and kind of puppy dog-ish the way he seemed like in Say Anything. I think for a long time people would see John Cusack and they would just be like, the character from Say Anything is him. And as a consequence, it was like, I want to share a milkshake with this guy or whatever. And I don't know if that's the case anymore. That said, I'm sure if you asked 1,000 women, would you rather be with John Cusack or me? 940 votes he'd get. Maybe I could get 60. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm being arrogant by saying that. But I guess that's my thoughts. So I'm going to let you guys go now. We're at 6. Although I guess, you know, if you want, well, how many people? Still 75 people. I'll still ask. Oh, you know what? Fine. I'm going to answer 5 more questions because, you know, you can leave if you want. So if you want to leave, you can just go ahead. Do you believe that history repeats itself? Sometimes, not as often as people think, but sometimes. I mean, we live in infinity, right? Time is infinite. And within infinity, everything that could happen will happen. So of course there's going to be some repetition. What's Fargo like? Fargo is real cold for half the year, extraordinarily hot for 2 months out of the year, windy for 12 months from the year out of the year. It's got a nice little downtown now. It was a good place to live. I don't think I'd want to live there again necessarily, not because I have any issue with it. It's just because I had that experience, you know, and I always love going back. Like if I could go to Fargo this weekend real easy, I would totally do it. It's just, you know, but I live in Portland now. This is where I am. Okay. Is a book on conspiracy theories in your future? I'd love to read your comedic intellectual takes on them. I would like to do a book on conspiracy theories. I would. I mean, haven't thought much about it, like how I would do it, but I would love to do it. Conspiracy theories to me are like, there's nothing greater to me than fictional interpretations of non-fictional worlds, you know? That's what a conspiracy theory is, you know? Is there a work of criticism you wish you wrote? There are works of criticism that I wish I'd done as well as the person who did them, but I wouldn't want to do what they did. I mean, that's, you know, it's like, you know, you get reviewed, right? People review your books, review your writing. And they very often make comparisons, you know, they'll be like, oh, you're like, you know, Hunter S. Thompson, or you're like, you know, Greil Marcus or whatever. They always mean it as a compliment, but it's never really a compliment. It's never a compliment for someone to say you're like someone else. The example I always use is be like, if I start a band and somebody comes up to me and says like, you're just like Led Zeppelin. Like, that's only a compliment if we're a Led Zeppelin tribute band. Like, Led Zeppelin already exists. I wouldn't be good for being just like them, you know? Wheel of Time or Waste of Time? I think you're asking, should you watch Wheel of Time? I'm not watching it. It would be a waste of my time unless it was good. So who knows? Okay. You know what? That was enough. We've done enough. And I do want to say to everybody out there, I'm not lying. Sincerely, I appreciate you sitting through this. Like I'm sure this seems like kind of like fake self-deprecation. Like I'm being like, I can't believe you're here listening to me. I can't believe it. I really can't. I just, it makes me wonder like what I did to make this happen. Like something had, like, is it because like my mom prays the rosary several times a day? like, is that why this happened? Sometimes I do wonder. I know that sounds weird, but I do wonder. It's like, it's so chance. But anyways, if you buy the book or if you read the book from a library or whatever, hope you like it. It was great talking to everybody. And thanks for sitting through this. Bye-bye.